The best outcome of this type of conversation is you become a better you because you're more aware of the strengths and weaknesses of your own tradition. You can interrogate your own tradition with questions that you might not have posed because they're questions that somebody from the outside would see that you would not see.
Hello, and welcome back to Religion to Reality. I'm your host, Dave Plisky, and I'm joined as always by my co-host and friend, John Gribowich. So far in the season, we have heard from a Catholic, a Protestant, and an Orthodox. And I feel like every time I do intros for this season, it's going to sound like the lead into a bad joke. But, it was our way of kind of branching out slowly as we intend to hear from people from across the faith tradition spectrum. And so hearing from our Christian brothers and sisters was a way to sort of ease into this. And also contextualize what it means to listen and listen well, and hopefully listen without agenda. And that's kind of our goal here in this season. And now it's time to hear from our Jewish brothers and sisters. We will be listening over the next couple episodes, this one and the next, to a few different voices from the Jewish community. And I can't wait to get started. Today, we are joined by Amy-Jill Levine. AJ is Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and University of Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies and Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. Member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Studiorum Novi Testamenti Societas, awarded the Seelisberg Prize for Jewish Christian Relations and the H. Walter Award for Interfaith Cooperation, and the incoming president of the Catholic Biblical Association for 26-27. AJ studies Jesus, the Gospels, Jewish-Christian relations, gender and sexuality in biblical interpretation, and the New Testament in historical context. Her publications include The Misunderstood Jew, the Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, Short Stories by Jesus, the Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi, Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, 6 children's books with Sandy Sasso, The Gospel of Luke with Ben Witherington III, the first biblical commentary by a Jew and an evangelical, The Jewish Annotated New Testament, co-edited with Mark Brettler, and by the way, sitting right here behind me in my bookshelf, The Bible with and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently with Mark Brettler, The Pharisees, co-edited with Joseph Sievers, and 13 edited volumes of the Feminist Companions to the New Testament and Early Christian Literature. Her Beginner's Guide series includes Sermon on the Mount, Light of the World, Entering the Passion of Jesus, The Difficult Words of Jesus, Witness at the Cross, Signs and Wonders, The Gospel of Mark, The Gospel of John, A Child is Born, and Genesis, A Beginner's Guide to the Beginning. AJ, an unorthodox member of an Orthodox synagogue, works to counter biblical interpretations that oppress and exclude. AJ, it is so great to have you on the show. Welcome.
That's a tediously long introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, now I have to include the whole thing or else that comment won't make any sense.
Yeah, you do. And there's other stuff that I had to leave out because otherwise the introduction would take up the entire podcast and that would be just silly.
Well, you clearly have done a lot with your time here. And maybe one thing I just would ask first, given how prolific you've been, what are you most proud of, and what do you point to as kind of your greatest contribution thus far?
Well, being prolific also means that I'm old, and asking what I'm most proud of. It really depends. It's much like asking who's your favorite child. So
you have one, but you just don't want to say. That's what you're saying.
No, I actually like them both. I mean, if I only have 2, so it makes it easy. If I had 5 or 6, then there'd be more to choose from. I want my work to have long-term effect. I want it to change the way people think. I want it to combat some of the stereotypes that people hold. So in that sense, excuse me, probably the Jewish Annotated. The 3rd edition of that is coming out this August. I'm not doing a 4th. It's just too much. But we know it's in the hands of priests, religious educators, pastors, Sunday school teachers, Bible study leaders. And it can show Jews the strong connection between Christian origins and late Second Temple Judaism, the time that Jesus and Paul lived. so that Jews won't have these misperceptions that I've heard in synagogues that, Christianity is just a pagan thing and it's all sort of silly. Well, no, I mean, all that stuff that's in the Gospels and Paul makes perfectly good sense within a first century Jewish environment. And to strip away some of the Christian stereotypes about Jews as legalistic and ossified and misogynistic and xenophobic and pretty much anything we don't like, so that Jews don't have to get used as the negative foil in order to make Jesus look interesting.
Oh, that's great.
Wow, there's so much to unpack with your work. I don't know where to begin, but I think it'd be really great if we hear a little bit about you and your journey, your story. You can start at any point that you want to start at, but how did you get to being as passionate as you are and being someone who's contributing so greatly to the way that Jews understand Jesus, and maybe from our perspective, how Christians can better understand the Jewish Jesus?
Yeah. Well, just to take the last part of your question first, most Christians I know claim to love Jesus or admire him or want to be like him. And it seems to me that if one admires someone, or indeed loves someone, one would want to know as much about that person's background as possible. So if we abstract Jesus from his Jewish tradition, we're not taking seriously his own humanity. And that's a denial of Christian doctrine. He is fully human. And we're going to wind up misunderstanding that context. So, in order to take the incarnation seriously, one needs to take seriously the time and the place that it happened and the people who initially told those stories. I haven't had a journey. I wish I had a journey and I could talk about like spiritual development, or I had a vision at one point. When I was a kid, and I grew up in a predominantly Roman Catholic neighborhood in southeastern Massachusetts, my friends told me that Jesus would come back the next time the way he came the first time, and that had to be to a Jewish virgin, and I was the only one in the neighborhood. So I had some panicky thoughts about that. That's no longer possible. Married, two kids. I grew up very much appreciating Christianity, which in my childhood was Portuguese Roman Catholicism, and it was gorgeous. I went to church with my friends, which was sort of like going to synagogue, sitting in a pew, watching men in robes speaking in a language I didn't understand, because I'm old enough to remember the Latin Mass. Again, I'm old, but you go to the synagogue, people are talking in Hebrew, whatever. And I wondered about, gee, how come there aren't any women up there? Late 1950s, early 1960s. And then this little girl accused me of killing her Lord. And I said, I didn't kill anybody, because if you did, you would know. And she responded, yes, you did. Our priest said so.
Mm.
So I had this weird view, because when we don't know about other people's traditions, we just make stuff up like it seems logical. So I had this view that the reason priests had to wear these special collars is because were the priest to tell a lie, the collar would choke the priest, which is actually a pretty good idea. So I said, is the priest dead? Because it had to be such a whopper of a lie, the collar would have choked him. And she said no. So I, being a rational child, think it's the transitive property of deicide. The priest said I killed her Lord. The collar doesn't kill the priest, therefore I must be guilty. So I started to cry, got off the school bus, early 1960s, I'm crying. My mother meets me at the bus and asks me what went wrong. I said, I killed God. So my mother assured me that things were just fine, which to my 7-year-old heart was very, very good news. And I found out later she made a few calls to the local diocesan office. Vatican II had already started, but Nostra Aetate, the document that says that Jews at all times and places cannot be held responsible for the death of Jesus, had not yet been promulgated. We just had the 60th anniversary of that this past October, October 2025. So I announced to my mother that I was going to go to catechism, to religious ed with my friends, because we all went to public school, so religious ed was after school. I'm going to go to catechism with my friends. I'm going to find out where this hateful teaching came from, and I'm going to stop it. Because, second error, I thought it was a translation problem, because in Hebrew school, one learned Hebrew. Nobody told me the New Testament was in Greek. Plus, I'm 7 years old. I had fabulous parents. My parents said to me, as long as you remember who you are, go, you might learn something. It's good to know about other people's religious traditions. So whenever I could, I went to catechism, and the nuns loved me because I'm the only kid who wants to be in catechism twice a week after school. And I love the stories. I've always loved stories. So in synagogue, we heard stories, and we heard stories about Abraham, and stories about King David, and stories about Daniel, and stories about miracle-working rabbis that we know from the Talmud, the post-biblical compendium of Jewish tradition. So I'm listening to stories that are based on the New Testament, stories about Jesus, and I'm thinking, boy, he sounds really familiar. Because the gospel writers, I mean, I didn't have the language for it then, but the gospel writers use what you all would call Old Testament templates in order to tell their story. So Jesus gets up on a mountain and teaches them. That's Moses getting up on Mount Sinai. It was, entirely obvious to me. Jesus meets a woman at a well. Of course, they talk about marriage. Now, they don't get married, which to me was kind of a break in the plot.
Hmm.
But I've already got the plot line. Jesus tells a story about a guy with two sons. I'm like, okay, go with the younger son, because I got Cain and Abel, and I've got Ishmael and Isaac, and I've got Jacob and Esau. And then it turns out that the older one's the more sympathetic one. Who knew? So I'm listening to these stories, and they sounded familiar, and then they kind of went in weird directions, and they sounded very Jewish to me, and I never heard anything anti-Semitic. So when I finally sat down and read the New Testament, a couple of things occurred to me. The two major ones are this is all Jewish history. So the first person in literature ever called rabbi is Jesus of Nazareth. The only Pharisee from whom we've got written records is Paul of Tarsus. If I want to know about women in the Galilee, the New Testament is my best source, along with some archaeological stuff that we've got. So it's Jewish history that the synagogue didn't preserve. And the other thing that occurred to me was we choose how to read. So I didn't have the language for it then. Today we would call this hermeneutics. It's the art of interpretation. So I knew, having read the New Testament, that one can come out having horrible views of Jewish practice and belief. I mean, the New Testament can encode anti-Semitism if read in a certain way, but it doesn't have to. So I wanted to know what it was from my Catholic teachers and most of my other friends, except for this little girl on the school bus. What was it that they were reading that did not turn them against me and did not hate me because I was Jewish? So if I could figure out what that switch was to make people read with generosity and kindness rather than with constipation, then I was going to learn how to do that. And if that didn't work, I was going to go to law school. So that's the trajectory. And I was very, very fortunate enough to go to a really good undergraduate school, women's college, Smith College in Massachusetts, where I had fabulous teachers in religion as well as classics and literature. And then I got into a PhD program at Duke. And I had fabulous teachers there. And I thought, okay, if I can't get a job, I'll go to law school. But then I got a job at Swarthmore College, which is a very good liberal arts school outside of Philadelphia, and got tenure. And, I thought, okay, I got tenure here. Well, if this is not working, then I'll go to law school. And then Vanderbilt bought me and bought my husband, which is why we moved. And now I get to teach divinity students, or got to teach divinity students. I can, so you can impact people who are actually in the pulpit. Fabulous. And I thought, well, if that doesn't work and if they hate me, I'll go to law school. I'm going to be 70 in June. I'm not going to law school. So that's basically it.
That's a really great way to understand exactly just the passion behind what's in your belly, because I love it in so many ways. What was it about, as you said, the one point there? Why did your friends hold something against you when you felt as if you were being accused of something? What were they open to at that point that made it realize oh, you weren't really a threat?
Well, unless I misspoke, my friends held nothing against me except for that one little kid on the school bus.
Right.
And her problem was what she had learned from a priest.
Mm-hmm.
So if one takes what one learns from a priest is what, kosher, or catechism, I don't know what metaphor you want to use here, as truth, then when people in authority speak such words, subordinates who don't feel that they need to look stuff up for themselves simply believe it. And that's a bad way of proceeding.
Right. So your other friends just weren't under the spell of the priest, so to speak, but this one girl was.
Or just didn't pick it up. I mean, I never got any sort of anti-Semitic sense from them.
Yeah.
They were just my friends. Great. I would go to church with them. They would sometimes come to synagogue with me.
Yeah.
And the difference was that they had snacks during the service and we had snacks after, but it's basically the same thing.
What was the practice of Judaism like for you when you were growing up compared to maybe how it is now? Was there less different types of interpretations of how to be Jewish when you were growing up, or what does modern Judaism look like? From the time that you were growing up to now?
It's like asking, what does modern Christianity look like? It's extraordinary. Jews aren't held to any particular creed. We are not a creedal tradition. So back then we had fewer options in terms of what congregations we could join. Today you can join a Reconstructionist congregation. Those were not very popular where I was growing up, although they've been around since the 30s. Today there's humanistic Judaism, which is Judaism without a theology. And you have humanistic rabbis and humanistic Jewish chaplains. Um, in my town, there was a Reform congregation, there was a conservative congregation, there was an Orthodox congregation. And we were members of the conservative congregation. My grandparents were among the founders in New Bedford, Massachusetts. When I was a kid, the conservative movement was not ordaining women. So that didn't happen, I think, until like 76 or thereabouts. Reform in 72. So I knew there were different synagogues, and they differed in terms of how much Hebrew there was. They differed in terms of could men and women sit together in the Orthodox synagogue? No. In the conservative and Reform synagogue? Yes. What did little girls get to do? So when I became 13 or 12 and a half, girls had a bat mitzvah, the ceremony that recognizes you as taking on the responsibilities of a Jewish adult. And three of us led a Friday evening service, and we read from the Book of the Prophets. And boys had a Saturday morning service, and they read from the Torah. And usually they were on their own rather than sharing with something. So it was clear that there was a gender-based component there. When my father died when I was relatively young, and when my dad died, my mother kind of got religion. So, we would go to we would go to Saturday morning services because that's what you did. And I went to Hebrew school twice a week. And sometimes we would go on Friday nights, usually not. And then after my dad died, my mother decided we were going to go say the Kaddish prayer. This is the memorial prayer for my dad, morning and evening. And that requires, at the time, 1970, a group of 10 men. So we're there, and it's like the second weekend. And my mom was not a very super forward person. I mean, she's really quite a quiet, serene person. On the other hand, she didn't let things get in her way. So it's like the second weekend. And like 14 women that are there and 8 guys, and we're waiting for 2 more guys to come. And I looked at my mother and said, "This is silly." And my mother said, "I agree, this is ridiculous." And my mother started to pray. She started the service. At the time, I was so embarrassed. Like, you can't do that. We don't do that. That's not what's done here. And all the other women looked at my mother and went, "Seems like a good idea." So they all started. And that's how my synagogue became egalitarian. And I look back on that now, and I'm so proud of my mother. And I feel like such a dope for being embarrassed at the time, but saying, because sometimes you just have to step up and do what needs to be done. And if you can do it in a supportive community, stuff actually can get changed. And I thought, oh my God, that's fabulous. What a great lesson to have.
That's great.
You mentioned earlier that concept of the people in the pews sort of just accepting at face value whatever the person on the pulpit says, and certainly that is an issue in Christianity. But I wonder. It seems like the Jewish tradition has a little bit more of an openness to response and kind of working things out, textually as well as just maybe verbally. But I just wonder, do you find the same thing within Judaism, or is there more of a let me look into this myself type of mentality among the people?
Jews are more likely to disagree. Jews are more likely to come up with pluralistic meanings of the same text, whereas if we're looking at what you all would call the Old Testament, the dominant Christian reading is it points to Jesus. And the dominant Jewish reading is whoever's got the loudest voice at the table. So there's a rabbinic saying that when it comes to the Torah, the Pentateuch, Shiva Panim LaTorah, that the Torah has 70 faces. So you could look at one verse and come up with 70 different explanations, and they're all partial because whatever you come up with is not going to be what somebody else comes up with. And you're never going to know it all, but you're supposed to continue. And there's a reason Jews do this and Christians generally don't, and it's a sociological one. Jews are not just a religion. We're not creedal. In other words, you could be a Jew and an atheist. It's hard to be a Christian and an atheist. That's somewhat of a contradiction in terms, given certain Christian creeds. If you're going to pray Our Father, that's presuming some sort of deity out there. Jews are an ethnic group. Today, if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. In the Reform movement, if either parent's Jewish and you're raised in a Jewish household, you're Jewish, or you can convert to Judaism. But if we think of ourselves predominantly as an ethnic group or a nation, then we can disagree, recognizing that there are certain very strong tension points. But at the end of the day, we're all still part of this nation. So watching our somewhat some of the difficulties in the U.S. governmental system, but at least the members of the Senate recognize they're all members of the Senate. and people who vote are all ideally all American citizens, however that's defined. So Jews can disagree, and they don't have to fear being removed for the most part. Christians, when you all disagree, you just found another denomination. So it's very, very hard to have that disagreement. The rabbi's just supposed to know more than everyone else, but the rabbi has no specific liturgical function that people in the community can't perform, or in the Orthodox synagogue that men over the age of 13 can't perform. So it's easier for us to argue.
Is the fact that there are, the Reform movement, the Orthodox movement, conservative, is that not similar to a new denomination in Christianity?
Yeah, sort of. The difference is that there are a number of people who are members of more than one synagogue. So I live in Nashville. I'm a member of the Shereth Israel, which is a modern Orthodox synagogue. And a lot of people who are members of my synagogue are also members of the Chabad synagogue, which is another form of Orthodoxy. And they're also members of the Reform Temple, which is where their grandparents were or where their kids were. So you can actually hold membership in more than one, and you can float from synagogue to synagogue depending upon what's happening on that particular morning. So the general definition is not I'm Catholic, I'm Presbyterian, I'm Methodist, but I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then somebody might say, well, what kind of Jew are you? And then you can say, well, I go to such and such a synagogue, but that doesn't tell you anything because it doesn't tell you what people believe or how people practice.
Yeah.
So I'm a member of an Orthodox synagogue. I don't keep the dietary regulations. I drive on the Sabbath. I try to keep it because I think it's a good idea, but I do admit to checking my email on Saturday morning. So my Judaism is what works for me. If I'm in the building, I play by their rules. If I'm in my house, I play by my rules.
Makes sense. And let me ask you one other thing about what you just said about Judaism being, more of a nation rather than, a creedal religion. How would a Jewish atheist think about Scripture? When we talked before we were a separate conversation, I had mentioned you asked me what did I think the Bible is, what Scripture is, and I think I said something like God's revelation to humankind. And so does an atheist Jew just really not engage with Scripture, and for them it's the community that's important, or how do you think about that?
Well, one way of engaging with the community is to engage with the scripture, which all the community holds to be somehow foundational, if not necessarily authoritative. So just as you can appreciate Greek mythology and study it and debate it and get a PhD in it without believing that Zeus is up there with a white beard and a lightning bolt. So atheist Jews can do the same thing with scripture study. One generally doesn't know. And for me, I tend not to ask. I figure that's really none of my business. So if I'm engaging with a biblical scholar on a scholarly concern, my first question is not, so do you believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior, and do you take the resurrection literally? My question is going to be, well, how do you understand this particular verse in the Gospel of Matthew?
Yeah. Well, let's just jump right into it. But before we do, I just want to ask one question. When you're talking, because this is really for anyone listening who's not Jewish, like when you talk about being a member of a synagogue, what does that require on your part? Like what does that mean?
You should pay dues unless you can't afford it, in which case you can
Okay.
just be a member.
All right. So it's pretty comparable to being a member of a parish. So,
Yeah, pretty much.
yeah.
Pretty
Okay.
much.
Cool. All right, so let's just jump right into it. I mean, I'm so fascinated with your work with Jesus's parables, and I think that if we could just unpack one of those, I think we can go down lots of lanes. So, um, I don't know if you want to pick one, we can just do it that way. I mean, or we can suggest one. Also, too, I mean, it's not a parable, but just the encounter, and you passed it along, you referenced it briefly. Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. I think that the way that story is traditionally understood in Christian Catholic circles is very different than your take on it. And I would love you to unpack maybe that one and a parable. Like, I want you to do your thing because it's so incredibly fascinating. So, do you want to start with that one actually, the woman at the well, and
We can start with her. So
Okay.
The beginner's guide on the Gospel of John gives her whole chapter. And if I had more pages, I would write a whole lot more because I really, really like her. So one of the things that the gospel writers do, we're going to call them evangelists, good news givers, is they draw on, to use Christian terminology, the Old Testament for certain templates. So the parable of the prodigal son begins, there was a man who had two sons. That's clearly an allusion to all these men who have two sons, as we have in scripture, okay, like Adam and Abraham and Isaac and so on. So there's a motif that we find, particularly in Genesis, but not only there, of a man meeting a woman at a well, and within 4 pages, there's either an engagement or a marriage, right? So already John is setting us up here to dip back into the Old Testament and see what's going on. John also likes to play with light and dark imagery. So in the previous chapter, which is where Jesus meets this Pharisaic leader named Nicodemus, who's quite delightful. It's at midnight, and Nicodemus never quite gets it. I mean, he's kind of in there, but not quite. As soon as we meet this woman, and it's high noon, we get it, right? We also know that Jacob met his beloved Rachel at high noon, and according to John, this is Jacob's well. So John's pretty heavy-handed when he says, "Hey, I'm making an illusion here. Pay attention." Right. So we know she gets it right from the get-go because it's high noon, right? She's walking in the light. There are multiple things that we can say about the story. What I typically hear in churches is that the woman was shunned by her neighbors. The reason she's there at noon is, well, nobody would go to the well at noon, so she's there when nobody else is going to be there because they're ostracizing her anyway. And when Jesus speaks to her, he's such a hero because he takes this despised, marginalized, ostracized sinner and welcomes her. Well, no. That approach is designed to make the woman look really, really awful in order to make Jesus look good. And in the same way, one does not need to make Judaism look awful in order to make Jesus look good. One need not have to make women look awful in order to make Jesus look good. First of all, she's not a sinner, and nobody ever calls her a sinner. She's been married a bunch of times, 5 times. We don't know what happened. John may be drawing on a story that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where a group of people called Sadducees who don't believe in resurrection say to Jesus, "Hey, we've got this woman married to 7 brothers. Whose wife is she in the resurrection?" Well, they don't care what the answer is. They don't believe in resurrection. And their question is designed to trip Jesus up and to show why they think resurrection is a stupid idea. Another story for another time. So we don't know what's going on. She's currently living with somebody who's not her husband. We don't know if they're in a sexual relationship, if she's taking care of somebody. If she can't marry, she's a Samaritan. They're under the same laws, Torah laws that Jews are under. If she's still contracted to her husband's family, we don't know the circumstances. But I have no reason to think she's a sinner. When she leaves the well after chatting with Jesus, and I think, by the way, they're flirting, all that stuff about, water spurting up in deep wells, and, wells deep, and you don't have a bucket. I got living water, which is a euphemism for a variety of things. It's quite a funny story. Anyway, she leaves her bucket and she goes to the town and she says, "I just met this guy who's told me everything I've ever done," which is a bit short-circuited. Think you could be the Messiah. Why would we listen to you? No, they actually go out and meet him and welcome him in. So the story's supposed to end with a marriage. That's not going to happen. Although we've had all that marital stuff. And that's Abraham's servant and Rebecca meet at a well. Jacob and Rachel meet at a well. Moses and Zipporah meet at a well. The well theme is so instantiated in the earlier scriptures that when the future King Saul goes to a well to look for his lost donkeys, and there are a bunch of women there, and they say, "Oh, we don't know where it is, but there's a seer down the street, turns out to be the prophet Samuel. You might want to check with him." And Saul says, "Okay." He doesn't marry the women. And that tells you right there from a literary level that his kingship is not going to prevail because he can't fulfill the convention. So John's playing on all that. And John's just taking it one more turn, one more iteration, and saying this is a marriage of sorts because it's a marriage of Jews and Samaritans, originally related and now estranged. And the woman is the one who facilitates this. So she's the first successful evangelist outside of Jesus.
Yeah,
She's
I
not
mean, and plus, I believe you kind of give more of an emphasis on the theological discussion that's taken between the two of them. Because when she's asking, well, you say that we're only supposed to worship in Jerusalem, and our fathers worshipped here. Like, it seemed there was a genuine inquiry on her part, and Jesus kind of respects her theological insight and how her orientation was at that point. I mean, would you stand by that? Like, would this be
Oh, I
a
didn't
way?
say that. I didn't say that, and I don't think he does.
Okay. Okay.
She says, "Y'all worship on Mount Zion, and we worship here." And she can just turn around from Sychar.
Hmm.
I'm not exactly sure where that is,
Hmm.
and point to Mount Gerizim. I mean, Samaria's not that big. There was a Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim till some Jewish king about 100 years ago burned it down during one of those difficult wars. Um, Samaritans are still worshiping on Mount Gerizim, by the way. They're still offering Paschal
Mm.
sacrifice.
I heard about that. There's like a couple of hundred Samaritans left doing that, right? And making
Yeah, and
sacrifices and things.
they opened up, I think, to take non-Samaritan wives because before that they were endogamous. So this question of if you continue, you're not going to be able to preserve your identity.
Mm.
And it's fascinating. They have their own Pentateuch. I mean, it's a wonderful tradition. So Jesus says, "Oh, hey, lady, we worship what we know. You worship what you don't know, because salvation is from the Jews. In other words, lady, your view is wrong." So Jesus is not being, pluralistic here. You worship here, we worship there. He's saying, no, we worship correctly, you worship incorrectly. But by the way, the time will come when everybody's going to worship in spirit and truth, which is John's talk for everybody's going to worship Jesus. And that's only the correct way of doing it. So Jesus is not sanctioning her religious tradition at all. That doesn't
Hmm.
prevent him from talking with her. But when it comes to, do we think your view is correct? I think he models the best way of doing interreligious conversation, which is, no, I actually think that I'm right and you're wrong,
Mm.
as opposed to sacrificing your tradition on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. He didn't do that.
Right.
And I think
No,
that's right.
yeah, I think maybe I misunderstood. I wasn't saying that he was necessarily sanction or agreeing or giving a sense of pluralism. I was just saying that like there seems to be more of a theological discourse happening here than a way that Jesus is kind of reprimanding her for behavioral or moral behaviors or something like
He's not
that.
right.
Yeah.
He's not reprimanding her at all for moral behavior. There's
So
no reprimand whatsoever.
let's talk about that. Why does that become part of the narrative of this? How does that become the Christian interpretation where so many are led to think that clearly Jesus is coming here to save sinners, and this is just another example of that.
Well, if we want to take the idea that everybody's a sinner and he has to save her, then fine. But then she's no
Hmm.
more a sinner than, Nicodemus or Mary and Martha, or any of the disciples.
Hmm.
So that doesn't really help us very much. And
Yeah.
then we have to invent what the sin is. So if it's a woman, then it's probably got something to do with sex. God forbid a man's sin would have something to do with sex. But
Right.
if it's a woman,
Right.
right? Mary Magdalene, 7 demons, she must have been a prostitute.
Right.
That kind of nonsense. Um, I think part of it is the concern of the early church fathers with human sexuality, and the idea where they're pushing things like the univera, the woman who only has one husband. We have that in the pastoral epistles. A true widow, or just with one husband. We have it in the second century church New Testament Apocrypha, where the big push is towards celibacy, and if you're married to consonance to non-sexual relations within a marriage. So they're reading stuff in terms of a sexual register, and she's an easy target for that.
Mm. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, let's go with a parable then. So, what's your favorite one to kind of just dissect and kind of
Set the record straight. Yeah.
yeah, enlighten
Yeah,
Christians with?
I can't do that one either because I mean there are some I like less, but there are lots that I really really like. I mean I can tell you the ones where Christians generally get it in a way that moves toward a negative view of Jews and Judaism when it need not.
Yeah, that's helpful.
So here are just one or two examples. In the parable of the prodigal son, a common Christian reading is that it's an allegory, and the dad in the parable represents God, and that Jews would have been shocked, right? Sort of a
Mm.
cosmic shocked. Jews would have been shocked that God the Father would welcome back the prodigal son. The Jewish God who's angry and wrathful, and so unlike the nice Christian Abba Daddy God that Jesus invents, another incorrect view. And then Jesus says, "Oh no, God really loves you," and Jews would have gone, "Oh really? Well, that's just all nonsense." And that's another model of making Judaism look good in order to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. Um, they look at the older brother, and I think Luke already sets it up to be like this, and then Christians will just push on it. The older brother is the Jews who were legalistic and trapped under the law. So when the older brother says, "Look, all these," to his dad, "all these years I've been working like an enslaved person for you." There's an enslaved person standing right there, going, "Yeah, I don't think so." Um, that's Jews that they look at following Torah as a form of horrible slavery. And then Jesus invents freedom of conscience or something like this. No. and if the older brother represents the Jews, then the ending of the parable makes no sense, because the ending of the parable, the dad says to the older brother, "Everything that I have is yours. You are with me always, and everything that I have is yours," which is legally correct because he divided his property between them. But it also shows that if this older brother does represent Jews, then they're still under the covenant. So what happens in Christian allegorical understanding is that the younger brother, the one who goes off to work with the pig farmer, represents the Gentile Christian, as if working, for a pig farmer turns you into a Catholic. And the younger brother represents the Jews. And that's just is a totally unhelpful reading. Similarly, Christians will read the parable of the Good Samaritan and frequently say, oh, Jews only recognize fellow Jews as neighbors, and Jesus invents universalism. Right? Well, Samaritans at the time actually were the test case. Are they in or are they out? Because they're under the same laws that Jews are under, the same practices. They worship the same God. So, like, are they in or out? It's kind of like Roman Catholics and Anglicans. You in or you out, right? Roman Catholics and Lutherans, are you in or are you out? This question, if you're really, really close, can you share food? Can you share clergy worship or whatever? Can you go to each other's church? They fail to realize that Jews have a different definition of neighbor than they do. The book of Leviticus, which Christians generally, at least my students, very frequently don't read and are convinced that it's awful. How would they know if they haven't read it? Leviticus 19, which is the same chapter that says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," goes on to say, "You shall love," the Hebrew term is ger, migrant, immigrant, not native born, sojourner, alien. "You shall love the immigrant as you love yourself, because you were immigrants in the land of Egypt." In other words, we have two different categories. We have the fellow Israelite, the fellow Jew, and we have the not Jew. We love the fellow Jew because the fellow Jew is one of us, part of our community, part of our broader family, because of identity. And we love the not us because we know what it's like to be not us. And if you're vulnerable in another country that's not your country, bad things can happen, like enslavement and genocide. So therefore, you need to treat the not you with the same love that you would treat a member of your own community. And Christians simply think, and this is very simplistic in terms of my own explanation, because Christianity is universal rather than ethnic. You're either a fellow follower of Jesus, so you're a neighbor, you're in the system, or you're a potential follower, or you're an infidel and you're an apostate. So with a universal tradition, there's no room to let the other be other. Y'all have to be in or out. And Christian pluralism is really quite a modern thing on the whole.
Yeah, that is a struggle of mine to grapple with the idea that I'm a member of the church, and that doesn't and that needs to activate something in me without trying to be this kind of creating me as a card carrying member that means I am exclusive far away from or outside of whoever else is not in this club, so to speak. But you
don't have to think about it that way.
No, you don't. But I don't think the church has done a good job of helping people to not think about it that way.
Yeah, well, probably not. Was it Francis of Assisi was attributed with saying, "Proclaim the gospel, always use words only when necessary."
It's attributed to him. They don't.
Yeah,
know.
I mean, who knows? That's why.
But I will say that
I think it's a good idea. And if you want, you can offer something that I've labeled eschatological supersessionism, which is just a fancy term for saying, well, okay, the Jews and the Muslims and the Hindus and the atheists or whatever, all those people out there, right? They don't get it now, but either when they die or when Jesus comes back, then they're all going to get it. So your job is not to bring everybody into the umbrella of the church. Your job is to live out a good Catholic life. And if people see that and they ask you about it, then you can explain, here's what it does for me, without saying, here's why your tradition is wrong. And then at the end of time, Jesus will take care of it. And I'm okay with that. Look, I'm not dead. And if that turns out to be the case, which I kind of doubt, but who knows, right? I don't do the kind of woo-woo mysticism stuff. But if that's what's going to let it happen. And you don't have to force people to believe stuff that's simply not part of who they are.
You may not like woo-woo mysticism, but it's hard for me not to think of Simone Weil when you're describing this whole situation, because I mean, like, here's someone who had some type of encounter with the Christ, and yet refuses to be baptized because it somehow would set her apart when
Oh, no,
really
no,
the
no, no, no. That's not how I think of myself at all. It's saying that I refuse to be baptized is kind of like saying you refuse to accept Muhammad as the last prophet.
Mm,
It's not a question of refusal. It just wasn't there to begin with.
mm,
Um, and refusal presumes a conscious choice, and I don't think faith is a matter of conscious choice.
mm,
Um, if you have it, you can act on it. That's conscious. But faith is like love. I mean, it's not like Sudoku. It's not like this logical thing where you connect all the dots and you say, okay, so therefore Jesus is Lord. One of the reasons Mark Butler and I wrote the Bible with and without Jesus is so that because people kept writing to us, particularly me, and saying, gee, AJ, if you just connected the dots from Genesis 1 all the way through to the end of Malachi, Christian canon, it would prove to you that Jesus is Lord. And so Mark and I went, well, no, that's actually not the case because Jews connect the dots in a variety of different ways.
mm.
But we thought, well, we'll tell people how Jews read this text so they will stop, bothering us. Or at least if they send me an email, I can say, here, go read this book, which is easier than having to write out a long thing.
I
So
love the
I don't think,
concept of writing a book in order to save your inbox.
yeah, and it worked. Um, and I got maybe a cup of coffee off the royalties, so it's not a bad thing. And now it's out in both German and Portuguese. Who knew? Um, so I don't think one chooses faith. I don't think it's a Pascal's wages sort of thing. I think that's really cheap. You say, "Oh, I'm going to believe in this lest I go to hell." That's a terrible motivation, right? Because it makes God
Mhm,
look like this incredible bully, and I don't want to worship a bully. Um, uh, so if faith is like love,
mhm,
you don't generally when you fall in love, you don't do a cost benefit analysis first thing off. Like good dental hygiene, college degree. I think I can date this person.
mhm.
There's something that bypasses the intellect that goes, oh, and we can see that in the New Testament itself. I mean, Paul knew his stuff. He doesn't choose Jesus. He got chosen on the road to Damascus. It's revelatory. It's not logical.
Yeah. Well,
So,
Simone Weil
so,
would say
so
the
for
same
me,
thing.
yeah. But for me, the term refuse doesn't make any sense. It's not like I'm consciously not doing this. I couldn't consciously do it because that would be unethical. I would be pretending to be something that I'm not.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. But how Simone Weil looked at it, she refuses baptism because she can't do it, like because it's more than what baptism seems to be claiming, which is being set apart. So it's like,
Well, but I don't
she
even think about
fell.
it like
Yeah,
that. Yep.
yeah.
Because you're putting me in the category of alienation from the community. I'm not worried about that in the least.
Hmm,
That's not why I'm not baptized. It's not because I don't want to leave the Jewish community. It's because I
hmm.
don't believe the claims that baptism represents.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm not saying that you are Simone. Hey, I'm just
No,
using it
God
as an
forbid.
example of something. I know your whole story is completely different. I'm just using it as an example from a different perspective. Yes.
No, I'm so in terms of leaving community. Okay, I used to be a member of the conservative synagogue here, uh, and then my daughter decided that she and the rabbi. I mean, she and the rabbi really did not get along, so she didn't want to go. And my son, who was at the Jewish day school, had no reason to go to the conservative Hebrew school after school because he's getting all this stuff in the day school. So when it became time for Alexander to prepare to become bar mitzvah, we said, "Do you want to do this at the conservative synagogue where we're members, but your sister hates the rabbi? Or do you want to do this at the Orthodox synagogue where we're spending 6 days a week there? The one day we're not there is Shabbos. Why? Because mummy's a feminist and mummy's not going to be disenfranchised." And my son says, "Oh, I want to do the Orthodox synagogue." So, I looked at my husband. He looked at me. He's like, "Yeah, we'll join the Orthodox synagogue." So you move from community to community. Um, it, it, Trading in that sense does not make you a traitor to one tradition. It just says this works better for me. And people who have understandings of why people shift from one religious tradition to the other, I think are generous about that. I'm not worried about my family disinheriting me if I suddenly became a Christian. I just don't worship Jesus, so there's no point in getting baptized. I think he's smart, but I don't worship him.
When it comes to Jewish Christian relations, you mentioned that it's not or any, I guess, interfaith, kind of dialogue. Um, you, you made it sound like, so we heard from a professor at Notre Dame named Gabriel Reynolds, who's a scholar on Islam. in Islamic studies, and he he talked about how good interfaith dialogue means disagreeing well. And it sounds like that you were kind of saying the same thing. Can you unpack that a little bit more for, in terms of what that looks like in a healthy way, and what maybe what a good outcome is?
Yeah, well, the dialogue, you have to have some sort of disagreement. Otherwise, you're not having a dialogue. You're having a kumbaya moment. Have a cup of tea and a piece of cake, and you're done. So interreligious is probably a better term, because I'm not sure this is all faith perspective. Again, you can have atheists who are part of some sort of interreligious dialogue.
Sure.
Part of it depends upon what the subject is over which you are dialoguing. A piece of text, a theological proclamation, an ethical problem, a pastoral issue. I mean, there are multiple things where people will come at the subject. War, right? Will come at the subject from different lenses. So a Christian might come at it, say, from just war theory. A Muslim might come at it from whatever Islam teaches about when you go to war and when you don't. And then you say, well, why do you think that? And what are the implications of that? And what are the repercussions of that? And in that communication, what I found is people will raise to me questions that I hadn't thought about, because they're coming from their own tradition and they're seeing something that I hadn't seen in my own traditions. Oh, that's really interesting. Let me think about that. And I can do the same thing for them. And then we become better members of our own tradition, or practitioners of our own tradition, because now we've got a different lens through which to understand it. So not only do we get to understand our neighbors more, but why do you do this? Why do you think that? What are the implications of that? But the best outcome of this type of conversation is you become a better you, because you're more aware of the strengths and weaknesses of your own tradition. You can interrogate your own tradition with questions that you might not have posed, because they're questions that somebody from the outside would see that you would not see. And in that sense, they're very much like really good university seminars where you have a bunch of people looking at a text and they all have different backgrounds. And when they come at it, they all see different things. So I give you an example. This goes back to the parables thing, which gets us back to John's question. So in the parable of the prodigal, which is a terrible title because it's really a guy who had two sons, we can ask, what went wrong with the prodigal? And Americans say, oh, bad parenthood, and no, younger kid, no sense of responsibility, blows all his money, no fiduciary responsibility. Younger kid got away with everything. It was bad parenting. One of my students said he didn't go to church, which I think is probably true. My friend Mark Allen Powell, who retired from the Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, likes to do sight reading. So he gathers a bunch of people from a particular location. He reads texts with them. And he reported once reading with a group of people in Moscow, Russia. What went wrong with the kid? They all said a famine hit the land, which is part of the parable, goes right over the heads of Americans because we don't notice that. When I was trying this experiment that Mark suggested to me, so I've spent a lot of time in Australia. And when I read this parable with Australian Catholics, particularly Catholic parents, and I said, what went wrong with Junior? The response is he left home. Because in Australia, like when you leave home, you really leave home. And kids very often will stay with the parents through university. So you leave home, you go to England, like mommy and daddy can't get to you right away. He left home, he cut off his network. And I had a student in a seminar, student was from Kenya. And she said, and the problem is that nobody gave him anything, which Americans also don't notice. So it's the same parable, but people, because of their own subject positions, notice different things in that parable. And each is correct, but each is incomplete. And there's probably a bunch of other things that somebody else would notice if I had more time to play with congregational groups on that particular parable.
Very quickly, you mentioned something about that Jesus wasn't really innovating when he started to call God, the Father, Abba. And I guess I want to hear more about. It sounds like there was more of a tradition of that, perhaps already like laid out in the Old Testament. Could you unpack that a little more? Because I feel like everything you say is going to be kind of helpful and surprising to someone. So I think that would be good.
The idea developed from a German scholar in the 40s and 50s named Joachim Jeremias, who argued that Jesus called God Abba, once in Mark in the Gethsemane scene, twice in Paul, so it's got pretty good historical credibility. And that Abba meant something like daddy or papa, and it would be a term that little children would use for the paternal parent. and that Jews would have found it blasphemous. And then a biblical scholar from Scotland named James Barr, who is my former colleague at Vanderbilt, fabulous man, wrote an article entitled, clever title, Abba Isn't Daddy, and in which he showed why it isn't. It simply means father, which is how the New Testament glosses it. The Greek, Abba ho pater, Abba father, let this cup pass from me. And Jeremias retracted his statement. He called it a piece of unadmissible naivete, but it somehow took off. So a Christian idea was that Jews thought of God as distant and transcendent and kingly and scary, like, with the lightning bolt. And Jesus invents Abba Daddy, God that stands behind you at T-ball and helps you with your swing. Jews refer to God as Father. Jews to this day refer to God as Father. The Hebrew expression is Avinu, our Father. That's how we pray. That's how a number of our prayers begin. We have God referred to as Father in Psalms, in later prophets, in the hymn scroll from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So when Jesus refers to God as Father, that's not surprising, in the same way that Jews refer to themselves as the children, right, under covenant with this God, the Father. What we see in the New Testament is the development of father language. So the historian in me finds this really fascinating. Father language increases as we go from Matthew to Mark to Luke to John. And I think that's the order in which the Gospels are written. And Paul talks about the importance of adoption. So that we can cry, this is Galatians, we can call it Abba Father, to a bunch of Gentiles, non-Jews, who are now, in effect, grandfathered into the program via Abraham and Abraham's relationship to the Christ. So for Paul, the sense is that for these Gentiles is they're adopted in. In antiquity, being adopted was really something. I mean, if you were just born, it's a biological accident, it's a crapshoot. But if you're adopted, it's because you were really wanted. And we can see this with Julius Caesar adopting Augustus. I mean, that's Octavian. It wasn't, Julius Caesar had a child with Cleopatra, but no. So God adopted you. How fabulous that is. And you can respond, Father. So I think it fits this missionary sense, particularly for people who are outsiders who could not refer to the God of Israel as Father, or never thought that they could, or never did. And suddenly they're part of the family as well. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. But we don't have to have a horrible, distant, transcendent, angry God of Judaism in order to get there.
Mm-hmm.
God already was.
So you don't feel like that is the general understanding of who God is by Jews today, or maybe Jews ever?
You're asking what do Jews think?
Yeah.
When we pray our Father. General understanding. That's what Avinu means, or Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, also our King. The prayer for the nation state of Israel, composed in 1948, begins Avinu Sheba Shamayim, which means our Father, the one in heaven. I think they borrowed that. So yeah, of course, Jews refer to God as Father. Do Jews think of God as Father? It depends upon whether the Jew believes in God or not. But is it traditional? Sure. But the question can be easily reversed. So if you say to Christians, or if you just went to church on Sunday morning and just you poll the congregation, when you think about God, what do you think? Right? And some people will probably say Father, particularly if you just said the Pater Noster, the Our Father prayer, and some people will think of God as God the Father, because that's wrapped up into the Trinity. And I say, who's Father? Jesus is Father. Think about God as your Father. That's usually a second step.
And so even the word Abba, you would not say is too particular to Jesus then?
Well, it's Aramaic. We have the same formulation in the Talmud, which granted is after Jesus. But we don't have that much in terms of Aramaic from the first century. So to say that we don't have any other first century documents just means that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Sure.
But the Talmud actually does have a rabbi refer to God as Abba.
Yeah. I just remember back in I guess it was in the 80s or 90s, the Jesus Seminar days, and the rating system always said that Abba is probably one of the most unique words that we could say came from Jesus.
Well, it's not unique, but it's likely to be historical. And the reason it's likely to be historical is severalfold. One, it's in Paul. Two, it's in Aramaic, and not that much Aramaic was preserved in a Greek text. So there's no reason for a Greek author to drop in an Aramaic word. And three, they decided to preserve it.
Yeah.
But it's not based on some sort of criterion of dissimilarity, which generally doesn't work.
Sure. You've done such extensive work and contribute so much to like just this the dialogue of I guess you want to say theological interpretation between Christians and Jews. I mean, how has it personally affected you? How have you felt in this process? Has this been transformative for you? Has it been enlightening in some ways, or like what do you gain from it? I mean, other than the fact that we know that your works are read and that you respect it, but personally, how's it been for you?
It's a difficult question. After doing this for over half a century, um, there are those nice moments where people write to me and say, "Oh, I just read your book and I had to change my sermon." Right?
Hmm.
That's lovely. I do a lot of clergy workshops. Um, just did a bunch of them in Wisconsin for Methodists. And people come up to me and say, "Oh, I never learned this in seminary, and I wish I had known this, and now I have to reconfigure." So that's really good. And then more stuff comes into the inbox, or I listen to some of the unfortunate statements that people who represent our government have made, most recently about Pharisees. Um, and the whole the whole anti-Jewish stuff comes floating back. And then I look at some of the abuses that Israeli soldiers have been doing. I mean, smashing up a crucifix. The most recent one is putting a cigarette on the lips of a statue of the Virgin, and this complete disrespect for other people's traditions. And I think, I should have listened to my mother and gone to law school. So I do have, and again, I'm old, and I have these moments like, have I wasted my life? Because all the stuff that I've been working on to try to get Jews and Christians to understand, that's enough. I can't do Islam. I don't read Arabic. Um, to try to get Jews and Christians to understand each other, and to respect the differences. You don't have to agree in order to respect the logic that got somebody to someplace. In order to respect faith like one would respect love, it might not be logical, but it still operates in terms of how people then comport themselves and what they do. Um, and it just seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. And it may be because people send me examples of bad sermons, and people send me examples of horrible things that people have put in print, or terrible blogs, or whatever. Um, but then good things happen, and you say, "Oh, okay, okay, this is good." So I mean, it's cliche-ish and it's trite, but it's an old thing about all the starfish that land on the shore, and you throw back one and say, "But it's only one star." Yeah, but it's good for that starfish.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's those minor moments where somebody says, "Yeah, I don't need to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good."
One thing we typically like to ask, which is, this season of our podcast is all about good listening and listening without agenda, hopefully. So we always like to ask, what does good listening without agenda look like for you? How do you cultivate that kind of practice?
I don't think it can be done. Sorry to
No,
suggest that
it's
your model doesn't work, but I don't think we can come into something without an agenda. That's why we're listening in the first place, is we've got some sort of agenda. We're interested in the subject matter, but we're interested in it for certain reasons. So I'd rather have the agenda assessed rather than come in as a blank slate, because I don't think we can do that. There's an old biblical scholar named Rudolf Bultmann who said you can't do exegesis without presuppositions, which is a fancy way of saying you can't read a text without having stuff in the background.
that was your point
Uh,
about hermeneutics, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, can I be challenged by this? Does it allow me to think more deeply about something? For me, because I'm always looking for, does it bring me joy? And those small moments where just a turn of a phrase or a new idea, and I'm good for the rest of the day. Like that's great. While I've been talking to you, there's been my computer overlooks my backyard, and there's been a groundhog out there, and it's the cutest thing in the world. It's got and it sits up and goes, "Mama." I think that's joyful. So when I'm listening to a podcast, particularly one about religion, and before I agreed to talk with you, I listened to some of yours. Uh, People with good ideas, people who buck the trend, people who say, I can make this justice work happen," and then it happens.
Hmm.
And does it come out perfectly? Of course not. It's never going to. But the idea that stuff gets done, and the idea that people can be passionate about something, and then what drives the passion, and can I find something that's comparable in my own life? So I'm not coming in without an agenda. I'm coming in with a bunch of things that I'm absolutely concerned about.
Right.
Does it bring me joy? Does it inspire me? Does it tease my imagination? Is it really, really bad? And then I have to do something about it, which thank God was not one of yours. Um, uh, does it make me a better person so that I know at the end of the hour I haven't wasted my time?
Yeah.
And one thing else that I do while I'm listening to podcasts, I knit. So that way I know I'm absolutely that at the end of the hour I will not have wasted my time. But I do the same thing with
Now, that's a
packaging.
Pascal's wager right there.
Yeah. And for the vast majority of stuff I've listened to, I have not wasted my time. But on the other hand, I carefully curate what I'm going to listen to.
Well,
So
you
thank
heard
you
it
for
here
bringing
first,
your
folks.
podcast to my attention.
I was just going to say, you heard it here first, folks. AJ Levine, not just a guest on our podcast, but a listener.
Well, I am now.
Yeah. Wow, this has been a lot of fun. I wish we could be talking for hours, but just continue doing the great things that you're doing. It's so incredibly helpful, and
Thank you.
it's so encouraging.
Well,
Lots
let
of
me know if
ways.
I can be of help.
Yeah. Yeah. So good.
Yeah, really great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for the conversation.
Peace.
What a gift AJ Levine has been, not only to her Jewish brothers and sisters, but to Christians, to help, contextualize the Jewish Jesus and to help us understand, better how to read scripture in a way that doesn't diminish someone else in order to raise up Jesus. And I just think that's a beautiful thing. And she's done it not just with a heart for it, but a mind for it, drawing us into the history and into the logic and into just a better place, I think. So much to learn from her. As we said, I would have loved for this conversation to go on, for a long time. But anyway, stay tuned for our episode next week, where we'll be listening to two different rabbis to round out a variety of Jewish voices that we wanted to hear from. Religion to Reality is not just a podcast. It is also a Substack and an Interfaith monthly gathering. So if you haven't checked that out yet, please head to our Substack at religiontoreality.substack.com, or just search for it on Substack. And that's where you can find the sign up to our Interfaith monthly gathering. Father John is also on Substack. You can find his at johngribowich.substack.com. His is called Going Analog. Religion to Reality was created and executive produced by me, Dave Plisky, and is produced and edited by Nick Stropoli and Connor Donnelly. You can find the show notes and other resources at religiontoreality.org. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.